Welcome back to Stepping in It. Over the next 3 episodes, we're stepping back to take a broader look at something that's often goes unnamed in policy conversations, but shapes everything in rural behavioral health. This series explores the intersection of culture, community, and care in rural life. When we talk about rural systems, we tend to focus on workforce shortages, funding gaps, infrastructure challenges. Those things matter, but they don't tell the whole story. Rural behavioral health is deeply shaped by history, by the legacy of the farm crisis, by economic shifts, by generational resilience. It's shaped by culture, how communities define strength, privacy, independence, and belonging. And it's shaped by relationships. The informal networks, the neighbors, the faith communities, and the local leaders, they often hold more influence than any formal system. This is a 3-part series. We're going to revisit 3 powerful conversations. First, what the farm crisis still teaches us about trauma, policy, and long-term community impact. Second, how resilience shows up across rural communities, from Alaska to the Midwest, and what it means for behavioral health reform. And third, stories from the field that remind us that policy is personal and community context matters. If we want sustainable solutions in rural health, we have to understand the threads that hold communities together and the pressures that pull at them. Let's step in.
And we're back. Renee, what is our topic today?
Oh my goodness, you wouldn't believe it if I told you. Jason and I were invited to a legislative agricultural summit for state chairs of agricultural committees from across America and Canada. And we're going to tell you all about it, break it down. But before we dive right into that topic, Jason, what's going on the farm in February?
Well, it's been a rough January. We went to haul grain in January, and we kind of were learning how to dry corn in the new dryer, putting it in a new larger capacity bin than what we've ever managed before. And we got a few hot spots, a few columns of rotten grain. And so I am selling custom fabricated 20-foot long, what I call the corn buster tool. And if you don't know what one of these is you go and buy 20-foot sections of rebar, and you weld a T-handle on the top, and you weld a 1/2-inch washer on the bottom, and then you carry that up into the top of the bin, and you have to go up and down and stir up the corn to break up that crusty part that's keeping the corn from going into my sump, which this year we will install one of those sump grinders so that it grinds the corn up. So if it does get a little rotten spot over the top of it, the grain can still come out of the bin. So we spent some time doing this because we can't get the grain out of the bin into the semi.
Wow.
So don't ever say grain farmers don't work hard, because this is really, grain farmers shouldn't have to work this hard. This is, livestock farmers always say grain farmers don't know how to work. Crawling around with this big 20-foot long tool and trying, because this grain bins are dangerous, right? There can be, air pockets underneath. So you got to be careful. You can only have, there's always 2 or 3 of us there every time we're crawling in the bin. So it's been a rough month, Renee.
Yeah, it sounds awful. And I can't believe that that's the highest tech availability that you have to fix it. Is
we've consulted with bin people. This is what you do. So I will sell these to you, right? We'll paint them to any color you want. We can fabricate these things all day long.
You're going to become the expert in this. What do you think the title's going to be of your new tool? I mean, you got to have a name.
Well, I'm calling it the crustbuster, but I'm not sure. That might be already taken by somebody else.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so that's what's going on.
That's what's happening on the farm.
So that could have been why we were invited to this conference right there. That scenario is one of the million things people at this conference might understand. But I'll back up a second. So the conference was put on by a group named SARL, SARL, which is the State Agriculture and Rural Leadership Group. And they are supported by the Council of State Governments and the National Council of State Legislators. So both of the national conferences that help across the country for the Americans, and they have a Canadian component too, are support staff that help this group. So the way we got here is my friend Annette Sweeney. This is Senator Annette Sweeney. She is the second vice president of this group. And Annette and I go way back. We were freshmen at the same time in the State House many years ago now, and we became fast friends. And the way that occurred was we attended our very first conference at Women in Government, which is now, I think, a part of CSG, maybe, I'm not sure. And Women in Government had this group, and they went out and they were going to go on a cruise. Well, little known fact, both Annette and I do not cruise, and we both get very seasick. So we became fast friends on land watching everybody cruise away because we're like, I'm not going. And she's like, I'm not going. So we're both from Iowa when that became the beginning of a very fun friendship. So now she continues to be a senator and in Iowa. And so when she asks me to do crazy things, I'm like, okay. So I got an invitation to come to this as the plenary speaker to speak about rural mental health. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but rural mental health is now one of the big topics in rural America. So I was very excited about that, but they didn't let me bring Jason, that makes no sense. They had signed me somebody from the University of Illinois to speak with, who did not show for this conference. They gave me a second person who came on to help at the end. So the plenary went off okay. But lucky for me, I got to bring Jason in and he got to help me with the actual breakout for rural health because I was like, what do you mean? He's the farmer. He should be here. And so, Jason, tell me your initial thoughts of this group. It was your first time kind of hanging with an agriculture legislative group. What'd you think?
Well, I was a little intimidated, I have to admit, of coming into legislators from all over the country and talking policy because I felt like, I'm not sure I'm qualified for this discussion. But I learned very quickly, more than qualified for the discussion because this is a really hard subject
Yes.
for people to understand. And so
Yes.
I quickly got over my intimidation and made friends from all over. And, it was an amazing experience to just be part of the conference, to be there all day, every day. The interactions we were able to have in the hallways and talking with folks, just
Yeah.
amazing, Renee.
Yeah, and so we'll talk about this in just a second about how this whole thing was structured. And it's very similar to conferences I went to when I was in the legislature. But what does SARL do? We have this book, so I'm going to read a little bit. It's the only meeting in North America bringing together state and provincial elected officials that are passionate about agriculture and rural communities. One of the coolest things about that conference were the number of people there from Canada in all of the different, their prefectures or their, I forget how they're broken down. They're providences.
Providences.
And so providences
Correct.
instead of states. And so we had folks there from multiple providences and lobbyists who came along. And so the very first thing when I saw when we walked into the conference center was this room for the Canadians broken out. And so we knew that means there had to be quite a few of them because they had their own kind of mini summit as they all came in from all over their country too. So that was really cool. So we were at an international conference off the top, didn't know anything else about it. So anything else about SARL that really stood out to you about what they do or why they're in existence?
It really was amazing to me because not being in that loop, it's amazing how all of the states and provinces share the same concerns and have the same issues. And to have a venue to bring people together and just share the same thing. I mean, whether you're from Maryland, Hawaii, Nebraska, or Georgia, it was all the same conversation of
Yeah.
how do we support people? How do we support our constituents? How do we talk about behavioral health? How do we create policy that's equitable for all? And I just thought it was amazing, not just the work that we're doing in some of those states, but then to see these legislators from such a broad background come together and have that conversation. And so I think that was what was unique to me. And a lot of times it was the agricultural chairs of their legislature. And, I will say the takeaway for me was that there's not enough people with ag background in a lot of these states to even serve as the chair. I was taken back. The chair of the ag committee in Chicago, in Illinois, is from downtown Chicago. She represents the district, which is downtown Chicago, because she has agricultural background. And she's very interested and passionate about urban gardens. And how can you bring agriculture to the inner city? But she was like, there was no one else that even had grown up on a farm in our state legislature. This is Illinois, one of the largest corn and soy producers in the country. And I was just taken back having the conversation I had with her, and her amazing vision of what she wants to do in Illinois.
Yeah, and I too was not raised on a farm. Actually, my parents decided to make us anti-farmers because my mom had been raised on a farm and was a farmer, actually a sharecrop farmer, and so did not want us to be raised on a farm. So it was on purpose to educate us, to move us out of the community and whatever. So we didn't move into big, I wouldn't say urban areas, but definitely more city than where they grew up. And so that was on purpose. So, but when I was a legislator in Cedar Rapids, if you pay attention to economics, Cedar Rapids would not exist without agriculture. The major companies that are there, agriculture based, whether it's processing of many, many kinds or, commodities, many, many kinds. But then like just thinking of banking and then the schools and the medical community, all that's there because of the agriculture community base. So I was lucky enough, I'm sure this was a Senator Sweeney idea, to be put in a group called Ag Urban Leadership when I was in the State House. And it brought us together, some rural and urban legislators, to talk about these issues, because I represented the main community of Cedar Rapids, which was one of our bigger communities in our state. But, the jobs and everything come from that sector. So if you don't understand it, you don't understand ag, you can hurt your own economy by not understanding. And so I think that's part of the conversation that I got to hear at this conference, and people understanding how the need to make sure that people get and understand what you guys are doing as farmers and ranchers so that people know. And so let's talk about like how this went down, because the whole weekend was hilarious to me, not really being from agriculture. But day one, we get on buses, Jason, and go on a tour. So what were your thoughts about the tours we got to go on?
I love the tour part of this. And so we got to choose our tour. And so I had not been to the John Deere factory in Ankeny. And so they build the sprayers and cotton pickers there, 72 acres under a roof, one of the largest manufacturing plants. And so it was fascinating to me, Renee. We got to be on those little carts and we got to go through building number 40. I've got to say, I've never been to building number 40 to see how they assemble the See and Spray and how every one of those sprayers is custom built coming off the assembly line, the robotics involved. Renee, you're nodding. Was this not as interesting to you as it was to me?
I cannot say that it was, but what was really fun for me are the little guys that do the tours, are retired John Deere guys, probably 20 years ago.
Retired engineers.
I know. Yeah. So they knew every detail, every date. And what's really cool is that was a military installation during one of the wars. They purchased that first and then turned it into this. They did shells. I think that was artillery shells. Women ran artillery shells there first. I appreciated learning that. And then the fact that they turned it into this, so they reused a big open space that had been left open after the war and turned it into something different. That's really cool. And these guys knew just every detail. They were so fun. They were just so funny. I appreciated them. The tour, for those that are not from Iowa, it was really cold outside that day. So this little cart would go outside, we'd freeze to death. They'd take us inside and it was really warm. And then they take us outside, we freeze to death, and they take us inside and it was really warm. So there was a lot of that. And that's not my gig. And so that was rough. Taught me about powder coat paint. I didn't know that was created, invented there. But John Deere Green, man, they're not kidding about that. They've got that all, man. And the number of robotics, super impressive. That was robots, unbelievable.
Amazing. Pretty much everything is welded robotically. The welding and the bending of the sheet metal is all robotic. I will say, and this is reflection of our ag economy right now. There wasn't much happening. The sprayer line wasn't operating the day we were there. And so normally they're kicking out 20 sprayers a day, at $1.3 million per sprayer when you buy those. And so that, definitely people aren't buying. Cotton pickers were going slower. Normally only 4 or 5 cotton pickers come off the line a day. That line was also slowed up. So, and the prices of cotton, we know in the South, our guys knew the price. They knew the average price of cotton and corn, and they knew what they were talking about. And we know that cotton prices are extremely low right now. We're looking at a floor. Right. And so that has a direct impact. And so, we've seen a lot of layoffs already this year from different John Deere plants across the country. And I think that's really the important takeaway, right? Is that there are millions of dollars of technology and the investment of these manufacturing companies. And we are leading the world in developing and manufacturing. A lot of this equipment goes overseas. Right. We'd always think about in our backyard, the things being built. They are going overseas, but we also have to remember, and we talked a lot at this conference about a lot of those parts that go into those come from overseas. And so this is really a global economy. And so thinking about any changes we make anywhere, whether it's tariff, we want to talk about tariffs or other things, of how that ripple effect is going to impact every aspect of our
That's right.
economy. And so it's
The other thing
complicated, right? It's
it
really
is
complicated.
complicated. And I learned, I mean, there's a factory for John Deere on every continent except
Yep.
Africa right
Yep.
now. That's
Right.
crazy to me. And
Yep.
so it is a global company. So when
Yep.
sometimes we just hear the snippets about sending jobs to whatever country, not necessarily what they're talking about
Right.
is it's still their company and people are, it's still there. So they just have a different product is in Mexico that
Mhm.
might be selling better. So people have to go there to help build what's selling because different factories have the different types of equipment. So
Right.
if you listen to the bigger picture, it makes a lot more sense. And so again, when people are being laid off or whatever, I didn't know this, but they don't necessarily stop getting paid. It's a different pay scale, but there's
Mhm.
unions involved. They have a really strong union agreement, so the unions
Mhm.
are happy with how things are going. It's just really in flux based on commodities. And so I did appreciate the business side of all of it. The tour could have been a lot shorter and I'd have been
Oh,
happy. But we also got to tour a place called Kemen, which I didn't even know existed in Des Moines, the city. And goodness, they sound like they do everything. So what do you know about Kemen and how do you put into words what we learned there?
I don't even know how we put it into words. I've always heard about Kemen Industries, always kind of known about Kemen, and I almost feel like I know less after being there because I was overwhelmed with all the products. And, kind of the takeaway is in every product you use, there's probably a chemical that was invented by and
Isn't
now
that
owned by Kemen that's in
crazy?
it. Whether it's what, keeps your Johnsonville brat from spoiling so it has a longer shelf life, or a supplement you take. Pretty much you could go through GNC, I think, and there would be one
Right?
product from Kemen in every jar of everything on the wall.
Right.
It's pretty
And
much
it
what I
was
learned. Yeah.
animal nutrition and animal health,
Yep.
and it's in human consumption products and
Yep.
food component products, and but it's laboratories, and so they're really, really brilliant minds in Des Moines, which is
Yeah.
crazy to me that you've got these high level engineers and laboratory chemists that are there creating and building new things, and then they acquire other companies that are also smart and have also smart people, and so that was also pretty crazy. But
You
off
know,
from there,
No, I was
what?
going to say there's another takeaway from there, though. For the
Yeah.
120 scientists that are working there, they installed a corporate Starbucks store. Like, this
Oh,
is amazing. When it comes to corporate, like, you think about work culture, right? They installed a Starbucks just for
that's
those
true.
120 Starbucks, for those 120 scientists to keep them caffeinated and
That's true.
happy at work, right? So let's just
And the
think about
barbecue
this.
joint. Don't forget the barbecue
Right,
joint that was
right.
named
So,
after the
right.
owners,
We're
right? So
not just saying they brew Starbucks coffee.
no,
It's actually a corporate Starbucks, full-fledged 100% store just for that small group of employees, right?
right.
That is an investment in people, which just tells you how important and how much it's worth the products that they're inventing and what it's worth for them to resell those products. And that's
That is
happening
true.
in a small part of Des Moines on the east side on a 40-acre plot with multiple
Right.
facilities.
Right.
Amazing. Absolutely
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. I was also impressed by the green energy that, they have that solar panel
Hmm.
farm in there and just all of the things that they do. And so I don't know. That is one of the coolest things about being a legislator. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but being a legislator, you do get access to some things sometimes that you're just like, wow, that's a really cool thing. So given
Right.
the fact that you don't get paid a lot of money to serve your state or your community that well, those are some perks that are worth doing because you learn so much about the jobs
Hmm.
and the economy and like all the different
Hmm.
things. So that tour bus then, Jason, took us straight to the World Food Prize building. We didn't even get off and get our
Nope.
cars. We got taken
Nothing.
straight there. So what
Right.
happened at the World Food Prize building?
I have to admit, I have not yet been to the World Food Prize. So I was really excited to be able to attend an event at the World Food Prize. And what an amazing place. Both a beautiful place, but what it stands for, right? The World Food Prize, as we think about, world peace and what it represents of supporting, agricultural ingenuity, and feeding the world, and it being right there on the river in downtown Des Moines, kind of that that building that represents, and then, you know, the awards that they give out every year, that represents how we produce food, and
Right.
what that looks like, literally around the world. And so to be in that building alone, if you haven't been to that building, go take a tour, learn about the background of it. And so, I have to admit, I didn't understand all the history before I went and read the walls and kind of walked around and better understood all of it. And it was amazing. It was really amazing to walk around and see that facility.
Yeah. And so we got to listen to our agriculture secretary tell us what his thoughts are on the world of agriculture and where things are going in Iowa, but also his view of kind of at that higher level of what's going on around the country in agriculture. And then what I thought was really cool, haven't ever seen this before, but there was a legislator there that needed to be sworn in by that evening. And in her state, there was another legislator there from her state, and they legally gave the other legislator the ability to swear her in. And so we all got to be her family and got to cheer for her and watch a swearing in ceremony of somebody else. And I thought that was really a cool gesture to allow that to happen, because she really wanted to be there at this agriculture summit and wasn't going to be able to because she had this deadline of swearing in. And so that was a really cool, just a little piece of it. So then Jason and I got to go home, and we did not think about the fact that we should have had hotel rooms. So we all drive back.
They offered those, and
We
I
should have said
really
yes.
should have just said yes. I don't
No,
know
so
why I thought, well, it's close.
Me
I can
neither.
just run home. It was a bad choice.
I know. And then the next morning, it's bright and early back up where I got to do a plenary session. And I won't talk a ton about that. But what we did is our normal talk. What I did was the normal talk that we give about like what life is like for people in their mental health space since COVID and all of the other traumatic things that have happened in the last 4 years. There's a ton of things, and that's just one of many things that have happened. And so talking about people's mental health. But what I wanted to do is make sure that legislators that don't really work in this area understood what they can do to be impactful. And one of the things that people need to learn, and I don't always have a good understanding of this, is that as a citizen legislator, you can convene people. That is the greatest power you have with any title, is that people will show up and get in a room for a meeting if you ask them to, because just to who you are and the name you have that attaches. And so being able to do that seems really simple. But when you're a legislator in a rural community and maybe your healthcare is not going the way it should, which is why we're talking about this, the fastest thing they can do is bring the CEOs of their hospitals in a room with somebody else who actually knows something about it and start having conversations. And Jason and I have led those. Jason's done a lot more of them lately than I have, but that's part of that conversation. So just making sure that legislators know that even though it's not their specialty, it is the number one issue that their constituents care about. And so Jason, talk to us about how we know that. How do we know that mental health is the number one thing that people care about?
Well, we're always referring back to that 2030 healthcare study that, talks about rural healthcare overtaking primary care as being the most important issue in rural communities. Kind of circling back, several legislators came up to me after you spoke and said, I forgot. We can convene people. People will listen. People call me about the same topic. And I'm like, why don't I just get them all together? And we have an hour-long conversation, right? And, so sometimes it's just reminding folks of, hey, this is how you can use your platform to gather people and make changes in your home community. And I thought it was really amazing. It was a light bulb that went off at 2 or 3 tables of people that came back
and you
to me and circled back.
You can hand it off, right? So you can have the meetings, but you bring the legislative staff, the policy staff, whose job it is to do that job, or the department of the state that's supposed to do that job, make sure they're included and part of that, then you let it continue the work that they're to do, but you can bring them into the room. And so, that was one of the things that I learned and actually made my counterpart angry in the Senate because my meetings were bigger than his. But what can you do? But it was one of those things where we were actually moving somewhere and people were like, oh man, we don't want to miss it. Because once you see that there's momentum, something's going to pass, there's going to be a bill. Oh my gosh, we better show up to these meetings. And so I just publicked it to death. There was not going to be any surprises. There was not going to be, if anybody at the end of that rainbow did not know what was in the bill, it was their own fault because it was so public. And that is exhausting. But it passed because of that. It passed because it was a complicated issue and people needed to have their say and have their little input into redesign. Anything you say redesign about, the public needs to be involved. And so we didn't get big public pushback at the end. There is some specific pushback that changed their tune later, but at the time they were being difficult. But that's the piece I wanted them to understand. And so sometimes we had to bring it down from where Jason and I talk about it with people who really get and understand mental health all the time, bring it down to legislators that are like, what can I personally do? And that's what they can do, is get people together to have the conversations. And so that was the plenary. And then we had an O Canada lunch. What did you think of the O Canada lunch? You went home with some
Well,
prizes, I think.
I did some. I have some Canadian maple syrup, which is very delicious. I'm a fan of Canada. When we used to live in Erie, we'd go up to Canada a lot. We've traveled to Canada for vacations multiple times over the years. And so, big affinity for Canada. But I was fascinated of the investment Canada made and the number of envoys that were at that meeting to speak directly to legislators from all over the country, specifically around tariffs and the impact of tariffs. And, I have to say, we got this handout, and it was how much of a hamburger comes from Canada, or how many of those ingredients go back and forth across the border. What was it, 30 or 40% of a hamburger, when you purchase a hamburger here in the United States, actually comes from Canada? Whether, it was those cattle who are born as calves that are then shipped across the border to North Dakota to be raised out in a feedlot. It really educational, because I guess I don't always think about how many times we go back and forth across the border, and remembering that 90% of the Canadian population is on our border, within 100 miles of the border of the United States. And so there is so much intertwined. It really is such an important relationship, especially in the egg community.
Yeah, it was really, really cool. And we had we did the Pledge of Allegiance for breakfast that morning. And they
Right.
decided to sing "Oh Canada" for lunch. And it was really cool
Right.
because nobody was a professional singer. But man, the crowd that got up that were from Canada, it was huge. Such a
Was
big
huge.
delegation. It was
It was
so
a quarter
impressive.
of the room. I think it was a quarter of the
Impressive.
room. It was
Impressive.
amazing.
And then they were going to do the national anthem and dinner, but I begged out by dinner. I was exhausted. So I don't know what happened at dinner. And then we had our breakout session. And this is the part that what was fun about this is I was directed, we could have no slides. So there was no
Right.
slides. So anything I said in the plenary was basically all the groundwork set, period, for the breakout session. And it was just a conversation. And how cool was it? We had people from all over the country. We had some of the folks from Canada in the room, and we were sharing the same concerns and the same suggestions and ideas. And that conversation about convening again came back around about, hey, here's some things we've tried that worked in other communities. You could try it too. And they're like, oh, we could do that. And so giving them hope that they could do something about this issue. So what were your takeaways about your breakout session?
Yeah, what I appreciate about the breakout was it was just a free-flowing conversation where we could
Yeah.
talk about specific issues in a state, and then another state would say, hey, we tried this, but it didn't work, and so we wish we would have done it this way. And it made me think about, other sectors as well. Where do you have the opportunities to go and talk with your peer group? It's such a specific niche peer group, but just thinking about in general, what a great way to manage a conference. When you can just have those structured conversations with experts, and then figure out how can we apply that on a wider basis. And so I just thought it was such a powerful kind of breakout to be able to do that. And, it wasn't just mental health. There were other areas that folks were meeting in. I just want to throw out there, like, at the same time, they have to be experts in carbon sequestration. I can't even say it. Carbon pipelines. You got to be,
Sequestration. That's
we
right.
think about water quality as a huge issue, broadband's a huge issue, diseases and disease management as we think about bird flu and what's happening with eggs and chickens and what's happening to flocks all across the country right now. Like, there is some really heavy stuff, right? And rural mental health is right up there on par with all of these really heavy subjects. And so it is overwhelming. I look at our legislators and I think you've got a lot of decisions to make and you have a lot of
That's right.
pressures on you. It's a very difficult job. And so to think about how we can support them in managing all of that, I think is really important.
Yeah. One of the questions that we got both at the plenary time and in the breakout was about mental health related to cell phone use. And
Mhm.
we're starting to see a lot more of that, not just in our state, but nationwide, talking about what we've done to our kids and allowing them to have cell phones and the mental health challenges that have been coming with that. And Jason and I are going to be doing a special conversation coming up for pediatrics. It's talking about that. And I'm guessing that's going to be one of the topics we're going to at least want to address, is where people can start getting some resources on that, because parents and legislators now are really asking what to do. And the governor, in her condition of the state speech here in January in Iowa, talked about that as well as one thing she wants to pursue. She does want to give, schools some autonomy on how to do it, but at the same time, there's already, with the folks that tried it last year, already some huge improvements. And they can see just the stories of like looking down the halls, and when there's no phones, kids are looking at each other and chatting with each other rather than staring downward and walking into people when they're in the halls, and just seeing connection again. And so that's a really big topic that I wasn't expecting. I didn't think that was going to be, when you think rural health, you don't think cell phone.
Right.
I don't, but I am now, because apparently that is
Right.
pretty common. And the lady that brought it to our attention was from Alaska, of all places. And so,
Yeah.
a long way away, and still talking about the same issues. So, Jason, why do we do these conferences? What was the whole tour about? What was the whole point of this conference? It's like, we did all this, but what's the point?
Well, you told me to. I guess I thought that was the point.
You didn't
No,
have to, but I figured if either one
we
of us, it'd make more sense to you than it would me.
no, we do this because this is what we love to do, and this is how we build those relationships.
That's right.
As we think about how we can, expand what we do, we focus primarily on the Midwest, but we're always thinking about how can we help to advocate for those rural communities. Every state has those rural areas, and it's different. What it looks like in those areas is different than what it looks like in the urban areas, and policy sometimes doesn't reflect the needs of all the constituents. Really, and that's what we're always trying to advocate for, is how can we design good policy that meets the needs, specifically in the behavioral health arena, for all people in those areas. And so I think this is a great way to start some of those relationships, to make connections with folks, even reminding some of our local legislators that, there are resources, and there's subject matter experts that can help you in starting those relationships and then getting people to think about it. We're going to a conference in Anchorage, Alaska. And so we talked to the legislator about, hey, are you going to be able to come over? And unfortunately, she'll probably be in Juneau, right at the Capitol, because session is still going on, which I've had to brush up on my capitals across the country. Just as a side,
Right.
sometimes I'm pretty on top of those things, but sometimes I got to pull out the map and be like, okay, Juneau, how far away is that from Anchorage? It's a
How
long
far is
ways.
that?
I'm
It
like,
is a long
where
ways.
exactly? Because sometimes,
Yeah.
it's hard to keep up on all of those things. And so
Yeah.
eighth grade geography I should have paid more attention. I now know. But, I
Oh,
think that's part of the fun of this, right? Is like you make those connections, and then when you show up somewhere, you can say, hey, we're here. Would you like to
yeah,
follow up?
that's
This is a
right.
great conference. Come learn some
Yeah.
more.
And for me, it was a lot of fun to get reconnected to those legislative conferences. I'd been out for a while, and just remembering how good the people are, and that the hearts are all in the right place when they run for office. And I remember being a legislator, and I know I told the story. I think I told the story, well, whatever. But I remember the farmers in there. I went to them and I would take their emails from constituents about mental health, gladly. But I'm like, when it's about roads, about how heavy trucks should be, how wide axles should be, anything related to harvest or whatever, you're just going to have to tell me what to do, and I'll trust you because you know. And it became that, because there's, to your point, so many topics in the legislature, you cannot possibly be an expert on all of them. And so I would find those farmer guys, and they were very, very good to me, to help me understand the issue, especially if I would get a weird constituent call, which I didn't get very many, but in Cedar Rapids, you might get like the water quality on the end of it question instead of upstream. And so I'd have to ask questions. And that saved my tail in the legislature. Those guys that were legislators could just really help, or those guys that were in the farming community could help me get it, because Iowa, we still do have quite a few people from rural, because of the way our districts are, and they are farmers, and a lot of them, and so we do have some ag qualified folks there, in both cattle and in crops, and so they are helpful, because shoot, I didn't know, and so I'm like, look, I'll deal with all your mental health stuff if you just help me make it through, because questions about eggs or how high does pile poop? Or oh man, so many questions. I was like, I don't know. And so I would just follow my leadership. So Jason, one of the bonuses you got after the end of this trip, you got sick. Who do we
I,
think we got that from? Because I didn't feel amazing either the first day.
Well, so, I think about being, cattle herded onto buses and in small areas and all of that. Yeah, I ended up with a horrible cold and cough and the whole thing. Every time I'd read about a different virus around the world, I'm like, oh, I have all of those symptoms. It kind of knocked me out for about 10 days. And so, yeah, the
Oh,
gift I got from this conference was being around people from,
yeah.
40 some states and 5 provinces. Yes, I picked up a horrible, horrible virus.
Yeah. Well, that rolls right into my recovering politician self-care policy of the week. How to avoid winter illnesses because they're
Yeah.
everywhere. And if you listened a little while back, one of the episodes in January, I was joking but not joking about how to survive legislative session. And avoiding getting ill is a big part of it because I had walking pneumonia as a legislator one year, and they called it community pneumonia because they're like, you picked it up from just the handles and the handrails, right? And so for me to be able to avoid illness, I mean, I think about supplements and what can I do to make sure I have that. I've built immunity. Unfortunately, I've gotten a lot of things this fall, so maybe I have all the immunity I need. Maybe I'll make it the rest of the year. But I also, if you're a person that's in office and you have some sort of power, I'm making sick people stay home. They don't like that. They don't really want to use their sick time, and I'll be flexible with them from work from home versus sick if they're up to it, if I can. But I don't want them in the office. We have Clorox wipes that we share. We're all about washing hands, making sure we've got quality soaps of various kinds in bathrooms to entice people to wash their hands. I mean, it just is all full court press because I can't take it. We're all in a small closed-in environment, spending a lot of quality time together in the office, and we're all going to end up sick. So for those of you out there, do your best, man. And if you're sick, stay home. This stuff that's out there right now, it's a week plus of being contagious,
Yeah.
whether you feel bad or not. So you got to be thoughtful about how do you do that. And it's hard, with work. Sometimes you don't have that flexibility to stay home, and then you're just going to be a super spreader. And I have a friend who had a little kid in school, and he was like, the whole class is like that. And it was weeks and weeks and weeks of everybody coughing. I mean, how miserable for the teacher, for the
Right.
students, for their parents, just awful. Well, today, everybody, we talked about the SARL conference, the State Agriculture Rural Leadership Conference, and it was the Legislative Agriculture Summit. They brought together the chairs from across America and Canada to talk about agriculture. And today we talked about like what in the world was that and how was it, but really like what our takeaways were from this conference and how we learned quite a bit of things. We were very lucky to be part of this, learned a lot. What an awesome opportunity. And we look forward for where this could go next. If you're interested in learning more, we've got some more information about them in the show notes. We'd love for you to join us. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you next time.